I work overnight security shifts for a local hospital in my town. It's not the largest or fanciest hospital in the world. Barely 2 floors, not that many nurses or surgeons, but it runs efficiently enough for our town. The late night hours can be rough, and it's not exactly super exciting stuff to guard the ghost town-like building once most of the staff leaves for the night. But it pays well enough, so I've never really had a reason to quit, save for maybe the boredom. I had worked this job for quite a while without ever really having any sort of incident, save for this one night in particular. It was a regular Saturday night shift. Most of the staff went home except for one of the receptionists, one of the practicing nurses, and of course myself. The ER kept some overnight staff on just in case any late night accidents happened and people needed to be seen, although that sort of thing happened few and far between around here. The night went on like they all did. I was walking my rounds, chit-chatting with the onboard staff, trying to keep myself awake as the early morning hours crept around. It was around 2 a.m. at this point in the shift, if I remember. I was sitting in the receptionist lobby, talking to the receptionist, when we both turned our heads in the direction of what sounded like a window sliding open. It was just faint enough that we almost ignored it, assuming maybe it was the nurse for some reason who was out of sight from the lobby. Although, after a few short minutes, the nurse came down the hall towards the lobby and proceeded to ask if it was one of us who was responsible for opening one of the patient room windows down on the other side of the building. We both said no, and I knew all of the windows remained locked from the inside. It was one of the things I check when I do my rounds. My red flags started going up, and as I stood up and mentioned I was going to go investigate, the main power killed and the emergency lights came on. I told the nurse and receptionist to go hide in the back office and to lock the doors until I came back and announced that the place was clear. They went to the back and locked themselves in, and when I knew they were safe, I pulled my service pistol and proceeded to slowly make my way down the hall towards the patient rooms. I started identifying myself as security, and that if anyone was in the building, they needed to come out and identify themselves immediately. No response. I found the room with the open window, and I could see scratch marks and a bending of the frame that would indicate someone had used tools to open the window latch from the outside, when suddenly the sound of glass breaking cut through the silence. It sounded like it came from the direction of the storage room where the hospital housed a lot of the meds. I began making my way over to the cold storage room, assuming that's where the noise came from, and the closer I got, the more clearly I could hear what sounded like someone rummaging through shelves and metal trays, trying to be quiet about it, but in a very obviously rushed manner. I got to the door, which was slightly ajar, and called out again that I was security, and whoever was in there needed to identify themselves and come out immediately. The sound of rummaging went quiet. I took a deep breath, pushed into the room, and was met with medicine and equipment that was all over the place. But I didn't see anyone. I slowly moved in, checking the few corners there were, when a shelf all of a sudden was knocked over behind me, hitting me in the back, and I turned around just in time to see what looked like a grizzled homeless man running from the room. He had just enough time on me from having to clear the knocked over shelf that he seemingly made it back down the hall and out the window before I could catch him. I went outside to case the building and found that a fuse box had been cut. Clearly, whoever this man was had planned out an attempt to steal drugs from the hospital. We checked storage and found some heavy-dose painkillers missing. Local PD was informed to keep an eye out for the man, and the rest of my time working for security for the hospital went fairly well. I think what I'm most relieved about is that man didn't try to attack me while my back was to him, instead just deciding to run for it. I just didn't see him hiding behind that shelf through the dim emergency lights, and if he really wanted to try and hurt me that night, he probably would have been able to. So, it turns out that one of the hospitals in my area actually has its own paranormal legend, and this was something that I was completely unfamiliar with until I experienced it for myself. I was working construction one day for my job when, long story short, I had an accident that resulted in my left leg breaking. I was taken over to the aforementioned hospital and was checked into a room, given a splint, got told the recovery plan, the whole deal. Now, This hospital, from what I was aware of, had been around for quite some time and overlooked one of the local cemeteries and mortuaries. You could even tell that some of the furniture in the room was a little dated, including one particular rocking chair that sat in the corner of my room for visitors. It was a nicely made wicker rocking chair that was clearly older than a lot of the other chairs meant for the visitors. I remember asking one of the nurses why they kept that particular chair, only to be told, "Oh, that's a very special chair for the hospital. We keep it for historical reasons." Fair enough, I thought. On my first night in the hospital after my surgery, I was in bed, messing with my phone with the curtains on my side of the room drawn, when I was met with the soft sound of wood creaking and rolling on the tile, like a rocking chair would make. I rolled the curtain back and peeked over towards the corner with the chair. It was dead still, but I'm pretty sure I know what I heard. I just chalked it up to one of the hospital drafts blowing in from under the door, which caused the chair to rock slightly. I just ignored it for the rest of the night and went to bed. I went about the next day as expected, having my checkups done, surgery went well with the stents, and doing what was advised by the doctors. The second night of my hospital stay came, and I was once again gearing up for bed, when again, I heard from behind the curtain the sound of the chair rocking, only a little louder this time, accompanied by what almost sounded like soles clicking on the tile as the chair rocked back. I peeked out again and caught the slightest movement of the chair as it came to a standstill. Now I was starting to become a bit on edge, being a bit more unnerved this time around. Getting to sleep took a little bit longer. The next day, I asked the same nurse why that chair was considered a special chair for the hospital. She responded by saying that chair had been in the hospital since practically day one, and that years back, an old couple had used this room when the woman's husband had grown old and ill. She sat in that chair till his passing, and a few years later had passed herself. The nurse said that some patients have told stories about how the chair rocks by itself, and that sometimes they hear voices coming from that corner. I got goosebumps, but tried to play it cool as if I hadn't possibly experienced the same thing the past 2 nights. Then the third night of my stay rolled around, and after the past 2 nights, and the story I was told earlier, I was definitely paying a bit more attention to the chair this night around. I was still in bed, curtain drawn, when almost like clockwork, I started to hear the rocking again. This time the loudest it has been. But this time, the clouds cleared out of the sky and allowed the moonlight to shine through the window, which illuminated a silhouette of the chair onto my curtain. I could see the chair rocking on the other side, as well as the silhouette of a person sitting in the chair. The sight was joined by a soft humming that came from the corner as the chair continued to rock. I didn't look behind the curtain this time. No, this time when the clouds rolled back over the moon and the silhouette disappeared off the curtain, I just covered my head with my pillow and did everything I could not to freak out. And it took me forever to fall asleep this time, but thankfully I did. The next day I asked if I could switch rooms. The nurse asked if it was because of the chair. I said yes in an almost embarrassed way, but the nurse told me I wasn't the first, and believed me when I told her what I saw and heard. After switching rooms, the rest of my stay at the hospital went without any incident. You never really picture a fully operational hospital as being the site for a ghost encounter, but I guess that sort of thing can really happen just about anywhere. I work as a practicing nurse in the intensive care unit of a small community ER. Working in the ICU and working alongside other trauma nurses, I've seen my fair share of injuries. Unfortunately, though we try to save everyone we can, sometimes there are those we can't. It's a hard part of the job, to be sure, that really weighs on you after a while, but you just have to keep doing everything you can for your patients. This story happened on a late shift, and I'm still not sure if it was the exhaustion that caused it to happen or not. I had just finished up assisting with an enteroscopy and was making my way room to room so I could check up on the other patients, eventually making my way to the more empty side of the complex. I was walking down the hall when I saw a little girl dart from one room to another at the end of the hallway. Rightfully confused, I moved down the hallway saying, "Honey, you can't be here. It's dangerous. Where are your parents?" But when I turned the corner, there was no little girl anywhere to be found in the room. I was dumbfounded. I knew for a fact I saw a little girl run in here. But again, the brain does crazy things when you're completely exhausted. So I just left the room, assuming I imagined it. While walking back down the hall, I ended up having to sneeze. And upon sneezing, I was met with a "bless you" being given from back in the room. I was certain this time that there had to be a girl loose in the facility that was trying to play a prank and who may have gotten away from one of the other patients' rooms. But when I checked, again, no little girl anywhere in the room. Well, now I'm really losing it, I thought. I went to the bathroom, splashed some water on my face to try and wake myself up some, and kept going about my shift. About an hour or so passed, and I had almost completely forgotten about what happened earlier in the shift since I had a million other things I was needing to make sure I focused on. But there started to be sounds of crying coming from back down the way to the side of the facility where I had the incident with the little girl. The cries were soft and sounded like they could be from a child. I followed the cries, determined to find out what was going on and to figure out if I really was just crazy. I followed the cries, of course, back to that same hallway with that same room. I looked inside the room and saw two small legs sticking out from behind the drawn curtain as the cries continued. I slowly approached, saying that it was okay and that I was a nurse and can help. I asked if the little girl was hurt. Then the crying stopped, and the little girl said, "Please don't let them take me." The legs disappeared back up behind the curtain, but when I got to the bed and pulled the curtain back, there was no little girl to be seen on the bed. But I can't just dismiss what I had heard and seen that time around. I finished my shift that night, went home, passed out from exhaustion, and the next day I decided to do some research. Like a lot of cities, we get an unfortunate amount of child abduction alerts in the area. Chasing a hunch, I decided to look up every missing persons report I could for abducted children. And amazingly, I found a report for a missing little girl who resembled the girl who I had seen in the hospital. I had never seen this girl before the hospital incident, but the girl I saw was definitely the girl in the photo I was seeing. It can't mean anything good, though, that the case had gone cold without a body ever being recovered, and that some of the only words I heard from that little girl were indicative of a kidnapping. It pains me to think of the worst, and to think of what probably became of that poor child. I couldn't say why I saw her in the hospital, except maybe she was still trying to reach out to people she thought would be able to help her. She never showed up again, and from then on, every time I passed the hallway with that room, I wished peace for that little girl.